I thought the stranger with golden eyes was saving me from my abusive ex. I was wrong about everything. The abuser was actually my brother trying to protect me. The savior was a fraud who needed my blood to steal a throne. And I'm the last living descendant of a family bred specifically to hunt and kill werewolves. By dawn, 100 wolves surrounded my apartment, and I could smell their fear. My name is Seraphina Nightbane, and this is the story of how I discovered I'm genetically designed to be the perfect monster killer, just as I fell in love with the monster himself. Chapter 1: The Scent of Blood and Rain. Rain hammered the empty parking garage like bullets on concrete. Seraphina pressed her back against the cold pillar, heart thundering as footsteps echoed closer. 3 months of hiding, 3 months of sleeping in shelters and working double shifts at the diner, all shattered because Matthias had found her again. His voice cut through the darkness like a blade. "You can't run forever, Sarah. You belong to me." She clutched the pepper spray with trembling fingers, knowing it wouldn't be enough. It never was. The footsteps stopped. Silence stretched like a held breath, broken only by water dripping from rusted pipes above. Seraphina's lungs burned as she held perfectly still, counting heartbeats. 1, 2, 3. Then strong hands grabbed her shoulders from behind, but instead of Matthias's cruel grip, these hands were gentle, protective. A deep voice whispered against her ear, "Trust me." Without thinking, she melted back against the stranger's chest, feeling safer than she had in years. Golden eyes blazed in the darkness above her. Not human eyes, something wilder, more dangerous. The man who held her stood like a fortress between her and the shadows where Matthias lurked. His presence filled the space with crackling energy that made her skin tingle. "She's under my protection now," he said, and his voice carried an authority that seemed to shake the very concrete beneath their feet. Seraphina felt the stranger's heartbeat against her back, steady, powerful, completely unafraid. Matthias stepped into the dim light, his face twisted with rage. "This doesn't concern you, stranger. Walk away." But as the golden-eyed man stepped forward, something impossible happened. Matthias, who had terrorized her for 2 years, who had never backed down from anyone, actually took a step backward. Fear flickered across his face like he was staring at death itself. The stranger's hands hadn't left Seraphina's shoulders, but she could feel the coiled violence in his muscles, like a predator deciding whether to strike. "It concerns me now," the stranger said quietly. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating his face for one brief moment, sharp cheekbones, dark hair, and those burning golden eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. Matthias opened his mouth to argue, then seemed to think better of it. He pointed one shaking finger at Seraphina. "This isn't over." Then he melted back into the shadows, leaving only the sound of rain and 2 hearts beating in the darkness. The stranger's hands were still on her shoulders when he whispered, "What's your name?" And for the first time in months, Seraphina wasn't afraid to answer. Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in the Philippines, I want to know. Don't just sit back, tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's dive into the story. Seraphina's apartment was barely bigger than a closet, but it was hers. She turned the 3 deadbolts with shaking hands, still feeling the warmth of the stranger's touch on her shoulders. Kieran, that's what he'd told her his name was when he'd walked her home through the rain-slicked streets. She pressed her forehead against the door and tried to make sense of what had happened. No one had ever made Matthias back down before. No one had ever made her feel safe with just a touch. The mirror in her tiny bathroom reflected a ghost. Hollow cheeks, dark circles under green eyes that used to sparkle with dreams. She'd been a nurse once, before Matthias convinced her that helping people was selfish and took time away from their relationship. Before he'd isolated her from every friend, every family member, every piece of her old life. Now she served coffee and counted tips, invisible to a world that had forgotten she existed. But tonight, someone had seen her. Someone had stepped between her and the darkness. Sleep came in fragments filled with golden eyes and the scent of pine forests. She woke to sunlight streaming through her cracked window and the memory of feeling protected. The diner would be busy. Sunday morning meant families and laughter and the kind of life she'd once imagined having. She pulled on her uniform and walked the 6 blocks through downtown, watching couples hold hands and children chase pigeons. Once, she believed in happy endings. Now she just believed in surviving another day. The bell above the diner door chimed, and Seraphina looked up from wiping down tables to see him. Kieran sat in the corner booth, those impossible golden eyes finding hers across the crowded room. He wore a simple black sweater that somehow made him look like he belonged in magazines, not in Mel's diner with its cracked vinyl seats and flickering fluorescent lights. Her hands trembled as she approached with the coffee pot, and his smile was soft enough to break her heart. "How do you take your coffee?" she asked, proud that her voice didn't shake. He studied her face like he was memorizing every detail. "However you think I should take it," he said quietly. Something in his tone made her believe he wasn't just talking about coffee. She poured it black, strong enough to wake the dead, and when their fingers brushed around the cup, she felt that same electric safety from the night before. "Thank you, Seraphina," he said, and the way he spoke her name made it sound like a prayer. Kieran came back every day for a week. Always the corner booth, always coffee black, always those golden eyes that seemed to see too much. Seraphina found herself looking forward to his quiet presence, the way he made her feel like she mattered. Other customers complained and demanded and left messes, but Kieran just sat and watched her move through her shift like she was performing something beautiful instead of just surviving. On Thursday, her sleeve rolled up while pouring his coffee, revealing the faded bruises that still decorated her wrist like ugly jewelry. Kieran's cup hit the saucer with a sharp clink, and when she looked up, his eyes had gone from gold to something darker, more dangerous. "He did that to you," he said, and it wasn't a question. Seraphina pulled her sleeve down quickly, heat flooding her cheeks. She'd gotten good at hiding the evidence, but apparently not good enough. "It's not what you think," she whispered, though they both knew it was exactly what he thought. Kieran's jaw tightened, and for a moment she could have sworn she saw his teeth sharpen. "Where is he now?" The question came out like a growl, rough enough to make her skin prickle. She stepped back instinctively, suddenly remembering that she knew nothing about this man except that he'd appeared when she needed him most. I won't talk about this." But Kieran stood, moving with a fluid grace that reminded her of hunting cats, and gently caught her hand before she could flee. His touch was warm, careful, nothing like Matthias's grabbing fists. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," he said quietly. "Not of him. Not of anyone." The certainty in his voice made her want to believe in impossible things again. Made her want to believe that someone could actually keep her safe. When her shift ended, Kieran was waiting by the back door with an umbrella and a smile that chased away the October chill. "Let me walk you home," he said, and this time she didn't argue. They walked in comfortable silence through streets that seemed less threatening with him beside her. At her building's entrance, he turned to face her, golden eyes serious. "If he comes near you again, call me." He pressed a business card into her palm, and the paper felt expensive, important. When she looked down, she saw only a phone number and a name, Kieran Ashwood, Alpha. "What does Alpha mean?" she asked, but when she looked up, he was already disappearing into the shadows between streetlights. Chapter 2, The Hunt Begins. Matthias found her Friday night. Seraphina was fumbling with her keys outside her apartment building when his reflection appeared in the glass door behind her. "Miss me, baby?" His voice was silk over broken glass, the same tone he'd used when he told her no one else would ever love her. She spun around, keys clutched like claws, and saw the rage simmering in his dark eyes. 3 months of searching had not improved his temper. I told you this wasn't over, he said, stepping close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath. Did you really think some pretty boy in a coffee shop could protect you from me? The way he said it made her stomach drop. He'd been watching. Following. Learning her routines just like before. Seraphina's fingers found Kieran's business card in her pocket, but Matthias was faster, grabbing her wrist with the same bruising grip she remembered too well. You're coming home with me tonight, he said, dragging her toward the alley beside her building. And this time, you're not running anywhere. Panic flooded her system as familiar helplessness crashed over her like a wave. This was how it always went. Matthias took what he wanted, and the world looked the other way. But as they reached the mouth of the alley, a shadow detached itself from the brick wall ahead. Kieran stepped into the yellow glow of the streetlight, and everything about him had changed. Gone was the gentle man who drank coffee and smiled softly. This was something primal, dangerous, barely contained in human skin. His golden eyes blazed with fury that made the air itself seem to vibrate. Let her go, he said quietly, and his voice carried a command that seemed to echo off the buildings around them. Matthias laughed, the sound harsh and ugly. Or what, pretty boy? You'll call the cops. But his grip on Seraphina's wrist loosened slightly, and she could feel the fear creeping into his voice despite his bravado. Kieran smiled, and in the streetlight, his teeth looked far too sharp. The cops, he said softly. I was thinking of something much more permanent. When he took a step forward, Seraphina could have sworn she heard something that sounded like a growl rumbling deep in his chest. And for the first time in 2 years, Matthias was the one who looked afraid. But then something impossible happened. Matthias released her wrist completely and stepped protectively in front of her, his body forming a shield between Seraphina and Kieran. Stay back, he said, but his voice had changed. Gone was the cruel possessiveness, replaced by something that sounded almost like desperation. I don't know what you are, but you're not getting near her. His hands were shaking as he faced down the golden-eyed stranger, and Seraphina realized with growing confusion that Matthias was genuinely terrified, not of being hurt, but of something happening to her. Sarah, Matthias said without taking his eyes off Kieran, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. Listen to me very carefully. This man isn't human. I don't know exactly what he is, but I can smell the predator on him from here. The word sent ice through Seraphina's veins. Smell? Since when could Matthias smell anything beyond his next drink? You need to run. Now. Go to the safe house on Maple Street. You remember the address I made you memorize? Seraphina's mind reeled. The address he drilled into her head during those controlling months, she'd thought it was another way to track her movements, to know where she might flee. But the way he spoke now, urgent and protective rather than possessive, sent cracks through everything she thought she knew. Matthias, what are you talking about? She whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her hammering heart. Kieran took another step forward, and something flickered across his handsome features, surprise, then calculation, then something that looked almost like recognition. Well, he said softly, his golden eyes narrowing as he studied Matthias with new interest. A nightwalker. I should have known by the scent. The word meant nothing to Seraphina, but Matthias went rigid like he'd been struck by lightning. How do you know that name? Matthias demanded, his voice cracking with fear and fury. That bloodline has been hidden for generations. Unless. His face went white as understanding dawned. You're one of them. One of the hunters who've been tracking us. He turned to Seraphina, his dark eyes wild with panic. Sarah, you have to run. Right now. He's not here to protect you, he's here to kill you. The world tilted sideways. Seraphina stared at Matthias, this man she'd feared, hated, fled from for months, and saw something in his face she'd never noticed before. The same green eyes she saw in the mirror every morning. The same stubborn set to his jaw that her mother used to complain about. The same scar above his left eyebrow that she'd gotten from falling off her bike when she was 7. "Matthias," she breathed, the truth hitting her like a physical blow. "You're my brother." "Half-brother," he corrected grimly, never taking his eyes off Kieran. "Same mother, different fathers. Mom never told you because she was trying to keep you safe from all this." His voice broke slightly. "I've been trying to keep you safe too, but you keep running from me, and they keep getting closer. The Blackthorn family has been hunting our bloodline for 3 centuries, Sarah. They've killed everyone, aunts, uncles, cousins. We're the last ones left." Memory after memory crashed over her like waves, recontextualizing everything she thought she knew. The way Matthias had isolated her from friends, not to control her, but because he'd seen things in their behavior that set off alarms. The bruises on her wrists, not from violence, but from him dragging her away from danger she couldn't see. The constant moving, the paranoia, the way he'd always seemed to be watching the shadows. He hadn't been her abuser. He'd been her guardian. "The night you ran," Matthias continued, his voice thick with guilt and pain. "I'd just gotten word that a Blackthorn agent had been spotted in the city. I was trying to get you to the safe house, but I handled it badly. I was scared and angry and I grabbed you too hard, said things I didn't mean. When you fought back and ran." He swallowed hard. "I've been searching for you ever since, trying to keep you alive while staying one step ahead of the hunters." Kieran laughed, the sound cold and predatory. "What a touching family reunion. But I'm afraid it's a bit late for protective older brothers." His form seemed to shimmer in the streetlight, becoming larger, more threatening. "The contract was placed 3 days ago. Seraphina Nightwalker, last of her line, blood price of 50,000 silver pieces. Dead or alive, though my employer prefers dead." The name hit Seraphina like a lightning bolt. Nightwalker. She'd always wondered why her last name was different from her mother's, why there were no family photos, no relatives at holidays. Her mother had always said her father died when she was too young to remember, that some things were better left buried. But now, staring at her brother's terrified face and Kieran's predatory smile, she understood that some things refused to stay buried. "The coffee shop," she whispered, pieces clicking into place with horrible clarity. "You were never there by coincidence, were you? You were hunting me." Kieran's smile widened, showing those 2 sharp teeth she'd found so attractive in the diner. "I've been tracking your bloodline for months. When my sources confirmed you were the last living Nightwalker, I had to see for myself. You were supposed to be powerful, dangerous. Instead, I found a broken little waitress serving coffee and living in a studio apartment." "She's not broken," Matthias snarled, and for the first time in her life, Seraphina heard genuine love in his voice. "She's been suppressed. Mom bound her abilities when she was a child to keep her hidden. But the binding is weakening, I can smell it on her. Give it another full moon, maybe 2, and she'll be everything our bloodline was meant to be." Seraphina's hands were shaking as she stared at the 2 men facing off over her fate. "What abilities? What am I?" The question came out as barely a whisper, but both men heard it clearly. Matthias's expression softened with something that looked like grief. "You're a Nightwalker, Sarah. Our family line goes back to the original guardians, humans who were gifted with supernatural abilities to protect the innocent from things that go bump in the night. We're faster, stronger, more intuitive than normal humans. We can sense supernatural creatures, track them, fight them. And kill them," Kieran added with dark amusement. "Very, very efficiently. The Nightwalker family has been responsible for more supernatural deaths than any other hunter line in history. Your great-great-grandmother single-handedly wiped out an entire vampire coven. Your grandfather took down a demon that had been terrorizing the eastern seaboard for decades." His golden eyes fixed on her with predatory intensity. "You're not just the last of your line, little Nightwalker. You're potentially the most dangerous human alive. The alley spun around her as the full weight of the revelation crashed down. Everything she'd believed about her life, her identity, her relationship with Matthias, all of it had been lies built on lies. She wasn't a victim who'd escaped an abusive relationship. She was the last surviving member of a legendary hunter family, with powers she didn't understand and enemies she'd never known existed. "The marks on my arms," she said slowly, looking at Matthias with new understanding. "When you grabbed me that night I ran, you weren't trying to hurt me. You were trying to save me from something." He nodded miserably. "There were 3 vampires closing in on our building. I could smell them coming up the stairs. I tried to explain, but there wasn't time, and you were so scared already." His voice trailed off into shame. "I thought you were going to hit me," she whispered. "The way Dad used to hit Mom." Matthias flinched like she'd slapped him. "I would never lay a hand on you in anger, Sarah. Never. Every bruise, every mark, it was me pulling you away from danger, sometimes literally dragging you out of the path of things that wanted to tear you apart." He ran a shaking hand through his dark hair. "I know how it looked. I know why you ran. But I didn't know how else to keep you alive." Kieran clapped slowly, the mocking sound echoing off the alley walls. Beautiful. Truly touching. But ultimately irrelevant. His form rippled again, and Seraphina caught a glimpse of something massive and predatory beneath his human facade. "The contract has been paid. The job will be completed. The only question is whether your brother dies quickly or slowly. You want her, you go through me," Matthias said firmly, reaching into his jacket to pull out a silver dagger that gleamed with unnatural light. "I've been training to fight your kind since I was 12 years old. I might not have Sarah's potential, but I know how to kill monsters." The weapon hummed with power, and Kieran actually took a step back, his casual arrogance faltering slightly. "Blessed silver," he observed with grudging respect. "Impressive. Most hunters these days rely on modern weapons. But you're old school, aren't you? Traditional methods for traditional bloodlines." His eyes flicked between the siblings, calculating odds. "Tell me, brother dear, does she know what happened to the rest of your family? Does she know why the Nightwalkers are being hunted to extinction?" Matthias's grip tightened on the dagger. "Don't." The word came out like a growl. "She doesn't need to know about that. She's innocent." But Kieran's smile was cruel and knowing. "Innocent? Her bloodline has been responsible for thousands of supernatural deaths over the centuries. The Nightwalkers didn't just hunt monsters, little Sarah. They hunted anything with supernatural blood, regardless of whether they were dangerous or peaceful." "That's not true," Matthias said desperately, but his voice lacked conviction. "We only hunted the ones who threatened humans. The rogues, the killers." Kieran cut him off with harsh laughter. "Your great-aunt murdered an entire pack of werewolves who were doing nothing more than trying to raise their children in peace. Your grandfather slaughtered a family of shapeshifters who ran a bakery and never hurt anyone. The Nightwalker definition of threat has always been remarkably broad." Seraphina felt sick. "Is that true?" she asked Matthias, and the guilt written across his face was answer enough. "Some of our family went too far," he admitted quietly. "But that's not who we have to be. That's not who you have to be. You can choose to be better than them." "Choice," Kieran mused, circling them like a shark scenting blood. "What an interesting concept. Do you think the families your bloodline destroyed had choices? Do you think their children had choices when Nightwalker blades cut them down?" His golden eyes blazed with ancient fury. "My pack has been hunting your family for 3 generations, ever since your people butchered my grandfather's pack in cold blood. Women, children, elders, none of them spared. The pieces of a larger picture were falling into place, each revelation more horrifying than the last. This wasn't just about her being the last of her line. This was about justice, about revenge, about cycles of violence that stretched back generations. And she was standing in the center of it all, the final target in a war she'd never known was being fought. "So what happens now?" she asked, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "You kill me, and then what? Does that bring your family back? Does that undo what my ancestors did?" Kieran paused in his circling, something flickering in his predatory gaze. "It brings balance," he said, but his voice held less certainty than before. "No," Matthias said fiercely. "It just perpetuates the cycle. Sarah isn't responsible for what our ancestors did. She doesn't even know how to access her abilities. Killing her won't bring justice, it'll just be murder." He raised the silver dagger, and Seraphina could see the family resemblance in the stubborn set of his jaw, the determination in his green eyes. "If you want her, you'll have to go through me first." The confrontation hung in the air like a drawn breath, 3 lives balanced on the edge of violence and choice. Seraphina looked at her brother, really looked at him for the first time in years, and saw not the controlling monster she'd imagined, but a young man who'd sacrificed everything to keep her safe. She looked at Kieran and saw not the gentle protector from the coffee shop, but an ancient predator driven by grief and the need for vengeance. And she realized that whatever happened next, whatever choices were made in this alley, nothing would ever be the same again. The life she'd built, the identity she'd claimed, the safety she'd imagined, all of it was about to crumble, leaving only the truth in its wake. She was Seraphina Nightwalker, last of a bloodline of hunters, standing between her brother's love and her enemy's justice, with powers she didn't understand and a destiny she'd never chosen. The moon hung full and silver above them, and in its light, she could see both men clearly for the first time. Matthias, battered and desperate but willing to die for her. Kieran, beautiful and deadly and driven by pain that matched her own. And herself, caught between them, the final piece in a puzzle of violence and vengeance that had been building for generations. "Choose," Kieran said softly, his golden eyes never leaving hers. "Run with your brother and spend the rest of your life hiding from what you are. Or stay and face the truth of your bloodline, whatever the consequences." His smile was sharp as broken glass. "But choose quickly, little Nightwalker. Dawn is coming, and with it, the rest of my pack." Chapter 3, Blood Moon Rising. The full moon hung like a silver coin above the city, casting everything in sharp, ethereal light. Kieran moved toward them with predatory grace, and Matthias finally released Seraphina's wrist, shoving her aside as he backed against the alley wall. "Stay back," he warned, pulling a knife from his jacket with shaking hands. "I'm not afraid of you." But his voice cracked on the words, and Seraphina could smell his fear mixing with the autumn air. Something was happening to Kieran. His breathing had deepened, become more controlled, and shadows seemed to bend around him like living things. "You should be afraid," he said, and his voice had dropped to a register that made Seraphina's bones vibrate. "You hurt something that belongs to me." The possessiveness in his tone should have frightened her, but instead it sent warmth flooding through her chest. Someone claimed her. Someone wanted to protect her. Matthias lunged with the knife, but Kieran moved faster than humanly possible, catching his wrist and twisting until the blade clattered to the pavement. The sound Matthias made wasn't quite a scream, more like the whimper of a wounded animal. "Please," he gasped, and Seraphina had never heard that word from his lips before. "I'll leave. I'll disappear. Just don't." His words cut off as Kieran's grip tightened, and she heard the distinct crack of breaking bone. "If you come near her again," Kieran said softly, "if you even think about her, I will hunt you down and tear you apart piece by piece." He released Matthias, who crumpled to the ground clutching his broken wrist. "You have until sunrise to be gone from this city. If I catch your scent after dawn." He smiled, and in the moonlight, Seraphina could see that his canine teeth had definitely grown longer, sharper. "Well, let's just say the police will never find enough of you to identify." Matthias scrambled to his feet and ran, disappearing into the night like the coward he'd always been beneath his cruelty. Kieran turned to Seraphina, and his eyes were blazing brighter than ever, pupils dilated wide. "Are you hurt?" he asked, and his voice was rough, strained. She shook her head, unable to speak, watching as he struggled with something inside himself. His hands were shaking, claws where fingernails should be, and she realized with crystalline clarity that Kieran Ashwood was not entirely human. Seraphina stared at Kieran's transformed hands, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. Those were definitely claws, sharp and dark, extending from fingers that had been perfectly human moments before. His breathing was ragged, like he was fighting some internal battle, and when he noticed her staring, he quickly shoved his hands into his pockets. "I should go," he said roughly. Before you see something you can't unsee." "Wait," she whispered, surprised by her own courage. "What are you?" The question hung between them like a bridge she wasn't sure she was brave enough to cross. Kieran's golden eyes searched her face, looking for fear, for revulsion, for all the things that would give him an excuse to disappear from her life. But all Seraphina felt was curiosity and a strange sense of rightness, like puzzle pieces finally clicking into place. The moonlight seemed to pulse around him, and she could see the effort it took for him to maintain his human appearance. His jaw was clenched so tight she worried his teeth might shatter, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool October air. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," he said quietly. "And even if you did, you'd run." "Everyone runs, Seraphina. It's better that way." "I'm tired of running," she said, taking a step closer instead of backing away. "And I'm tired of people making decisions for me." Something flickered in his eyes, hope, maybe, or recognition. "I've been hiding and afraid for so long, I barely remember what it feels like to be brave. But you make me feel brave." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "So tell me the truth." "All of it." Kieran closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were blazing with an inner fire that had nothing to do with streetlights or moonbeams. "I'm a werewolf," he said simply. "Not just any werewolf, I'm the Alpha King of the Northern Pack. And from the moment I scented you in that parking garage, I knew you were mine." He watched her face carefully, waiting for the moment when terror would replace trust. But Seraphina just nodded slowly, like she'd been waiting her whole life to hear those words. "I know," she whispered. "I've known since the first night. I just didn't have a name for it." Chapter 4, The Pack Arrives. Dawn was breaking over the city in streaks of pink and gold when Seraphina heard the howling. It started as a single voice in the distance, then multiplied until the sound surrounded her small apartment building like a living thing. She pressed her face to the window and felt her heart stop. The street below was filled with wolves, massive, silver-gray creatures with eyes that glowed in the early morning light. They sat in perfect formation, watching her building with an intelligence that was definitely not animal. Kieran appeared at her door before she could finish counting them. He looked exhausted, like he'd been running all night, and his clothes were torn in places that suggested he'd shifted between forms more than once. "How many?" she asked quietly, and he didn't need to ask what she meant. 97 so far," he said, slumping against her doorframe. "The pack felt what happened last night. They know about you now. Are they here to protect me or kill me?" The question came out calmer than she felt. Through the window, she could see more wolves emerging from alleys and side streets, padding silently into formation with their packmates. Their coordination was beautiful and terrifying, like watching an army take position for battle. Kieran's expression was grim. "Both, potentially. You're human, Seraphina. Unmated. And you know our secret. But you're their Alpha King," she said, trying to understand. "Doesn't that mean they have to listen to you?" Kieran's laugh was bitter. "It means they have to obey direct orders. It doesn't mean they have to like those orders, or that they won't find ways around them." He moved to the window, and several of the wolves below lifted their heads to watch him. My beta, Marcus, has been questioning my judgment lately. He thinks I'm too soft, too willing to trust outsiders. A new howl rose from the street, deeper and more commanding than the others. The wolves below shifted restlessly, some whining low in their throats. That's him, Kieran said quietly. He's calling for a pack meeting. They want to decide your fate. Seraphina felt ice forming in her stomach. And if they decide wrong? Kieran's hand found hers, warm and steady despite everything. Then I fight them all, he said simply. Every last one, if that's what it takes to keep you safe. Through the window, she could see the sun climbing higher, and she realized that the 100 wolves surrounding her home weren't just a threat, they were a declaration of war. But something was wrong. As more wolves emerged from the shadows, Seraphina noticed that many of them weren't looking at her window, they were looking at Kieran with expressions that seemed more calculating than submissive. Some bared their teeth slightly when his back was turned, others paced restlessly like they were waiting for something. The perfect formation she'd admired moments before suddenly looked less like military precision and more like a trap closing around them. Kieran, she said slowly, her voice tight with growing unease. Why do some of them look like they want to tear you apart instead of me? His shoulders went rigid, and when he turned from the window, she caught a flicker of something in his golden eyes that looked suspiciously like fear. Pack politics are complicated, he said, but his voice lacked the confidence she'd grown used to hearing. Marcus has been stirring up dissent. Some of the wolves question whether I'm making the right choices for the pack. The largest wolf in the formation below. A massive black creature with silver markings around his muzzle, lifted his head and released another howl. This one was different, carrying notes that made the hair on Seraphina's arms stand on end. It wasn't a call to assembly. It was a challenge. Every wolf in the street responded, their voices joining in a chorus that spoke of judgment and reckoning. Kieran's face went white as the song reached its crescendo. What are they saying? Seraphina asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Kieran's hands were shaking as he ran them through his dark hair. They're calling for a trial of truth, he said quietly. It's an ancient ritual. When the pack questions their alpha's right to rule, they can demand he prove his legitimacy before the assembled wolves. His golden eyes met hers, and she saw desperation there that made her stomach clench. If I fail the trial, they'll tear me apart and choose a new leader. Then we'll face it together, she said, reaching for his hand. But instead of comfort, she felt him flinch away from her touch. You don't understand, Seraphina. A trial of truth isn't just about leadership. It's about honesty. Complete, absolute honesty. The pack can scent lies, read body language, detect deception in ways humans can't imagine. He was backing toward the door, his movements jerky with panic. And if they discover I've been lying about anything at all, the penalty is death. The way he said it sent ice through her veins. What have you been lying about? The question hung in the air between them like a blade, and Kieran's expression crumbled into something that looked like grief and terror combined. Before he could answer, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway outside her apartment. Heavy, purposeful steps that spoke of authority and power. Someone was coming up the stairs. The door burst open without a knock, without ceremony, without any of the courtesy she'd expected from supernatural beings. 3 wolves in human form filled her tiny apartment, their presence making the space feel claustrophobic and dangerous. The leader was tall and broad-shouldered, with the same golden eyes as Kieran but older, harder, carved from stone and bitter experience. When he looked at Kieran, his expression held a mixture of rage and grief that made Seraphina step instinctively between them. "Hello, brother," the man said, and his voice carried centuries of pain and betrayal. "Did you really think you could hide from us forever?" Seraphina's mind reeled. Brother? But Kieran had never mentioned having a brother, never spoken of family beyond the pack. The golden-eyed stranger continued, his gaze never leaving Kieran's face. 3 months. 3 months you've been wearing his scent, using his name, pretending to be someone you could never measure up to. Marcus, Kieran said, and his voice cracked on the name. I can explain, but Marcus cut him off with a gesture that spoke of absolute authority. Explain? You want to explain how you've been parading around as the Alpha King when the real Alpha King, your twin brother, has been dead for 3 months? The words hit Seraphina like physical blows, each revelation worse than the last. The other 2 wolves moved to flank Marcus, their expressions grim but not surprised. This wasn't news to them. This was a confrontation they'd been planning, possibly for weeks. The hunting accident in the mountains, Marcus continued relentlessly. Kale fell into that ravine trying to save a human child. His body was never recovered, but we found enough blood to know he was gone. And while the pack grieved for their true king, you stole his identity and claimed his throne. Seraphina stared at Kieran, at the man who'd saved her, protected her, made her feel safe for the first time in years, and felt her world tilt sideways. You're not the Alpha King, she whispered, and it wasn't a question. The guilty anguish on his face was answer enough. You're not even an alpha at all, are you? His silence spoke volumes, and she felt something crack inside her chest. Who are you really? His name is Kieran Ashwood, Marcus said when it became clear that Kieran wouldn't answer. Kale's twin brother, born 2 minutes after him. Second son, second choice, second best at everything that mattered. He's been living in Kale's shadow his entire life, and when our true alpha died, he finally saw his chance to step into the light. Marcus's voice was hard as granite. Even if it meant betraying everything the pack stands for. The room spun around Seraphina as she processed the magnitude of the deception. Every moment they'd shared, every word he'd spoken, every promise he'd made, all of it built on lies. The business card, she said numbly, remembering the expensive paper with Alpha printed beneath his name. The way you commanded Matthias to back down, the way you moved like you owned the world, it was all an act? Not all of it, Kieran said desperately, finally finding his voice. My feelings for you, the way I want to protect you, that's real, Seraphina. That's the only real thing in any of this. But his words felt hollow now, tainted by the enormity of his deception. How could she believe anything he said when he'd built their entire relationship on a foundation of lies? Marcus stepped closer, his golden eyes boring into Kieran with laser intensity. Tell her the rest, he commanded. Tell her why you really sought her out. Tell her about the prophecy. Kieran's face went ashen, and Seraphina felt dread pooling in her stomach like ice water. There was more. Of course there was more. There's an ancient law, Kieran said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. If a wolf of royal blood bonds with a human of supernatural lineage, their union can legitimize claims to leadership. The combined power of their bloodlines creates a mandate that even the Pack Council can't dispute. He couldn't meet her eyes as he continued. When I discovered you were a Nightwalker, when I realized your abilities were awakening. You saw an opportunity, Seraphina finished, the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. You didn't save me because you cared about me. You saved me because you needed me. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound, slicing through her chest like a blade made of ice and broken promises. I was never anything more than a means to an end. That's not true, Kieran said desperately, reaching for her. It started that way, yes, but everything changed. You changed everything. What I feel for you now, Marcus's harsh laugh cut him off. What you feel for her is irrelevant. You've committed the highest crime a wolf can commit. You've impersonated an alpha and led the pack under false pretenses. The penalty for that is death by pack justice. The 2 wolves flanking Marcus moved closer, and Seraphina could see the violence brewing in their eyes. They weren't here to arrest Kieran or banish him. They were here to execute him. Wait, she said, stepping between them and Kieran despite everything. If what he says about the prophecy is true, if our union could legitimize his claim. It could, Marcus agreed grimly. If you were bonded as true mates, if the ritual was completed under the full moon, the pack laws would recognize his right to rule. His smile was sharp as broken glass. But that would require you to willingly bind yourself to a man who's done nothing but lie to you since the moment you met. Are you prepared to sacrifice your freedom for a fraud? The question hung in the air like a death sentence. Seraphina looked at Kieran, really looked at him, and saw past the golden eyes and sharp cheekbones to the desperate, broken man underneath. He'd lost his brother, his identity, his place in the world. And in his grief and desperation, he'd chosen deception over truth, manipulation over honesty. But she also saw the genuine anguish in his expression, the way his hands shook with the knowledge that he'd destroyed the one good thing in his life. The pack is waiting, Marcus said, checking his watch with deliberate casualness. In 10 minutes, we go downstairs and you face trial of truth. Every lie you've told, every deception you've crafted, every moment you've pretended to be someone you're not, all of it will be exposed before the assembled wolves. And then. He didn't need to finish the sentence. They all knew how trials like this ended. Unless, one of the other wolves said quietly, speaking for the first time since they'd entered the apartment. The Nightwalker chooses to invoke the right of sanctuary. If she claims you as her true mate before the pack, if she's willing to stake her life on your worth, the trial becomes a bonding challenge instead of an execution. His eyes fixed on Seraphina with uncomfortable intensity. But be warned, if the bond fails, if the magic rejects your union, you both die. Seraphina felt the weight of a dozen impossible choices pressing down on her shoulders. Trust the man who'd lied to her about everything that mattered? Risk her life for someone who'd seen her as nothing more than a political tool? Or watch him die and live with the knowledge that she could have saved him? Outside, the howling of 100 wolves filled the morning air, their voices calling for justice, for truth, for blood. I need a moment, she said, and her voice sounded strange and distant to her own ears. Just, give me a moment to think. Marcus nodded curtly. You have 5 minutes. Then we go downstairs and face the pack, one way or another. The 3 wolves filed out of her apartment, leaving her alone with Kieran and the wreckage of everything she believed. Kieran slumped against the wall, his face buried in his hands. I'm sorry, he said, and the words sounded like they were being torn from his soul. I'm so goddamn sorry, Seraphina. You deserved better than this. You deserved better than me. When he looked up, his golden eyes were bright with unshed tears. I never meant for it to go this far. I never meant to fall in love with you. Love? The word tasted bitter on her tongue. How can you call it love when everything between us has been built on lies? But even as she said it, she remembered the way he'd held her in the parking garage, the gentleness in his touch, the way he'd made her feel safe and valued and seen. Had all of that been an act? Or was it possible for real feelings to grow from false foundations? Because when I'm with you, I forget about the throne, the pack, the prophecy, all of it, he said quietly. When I'm with you, I'm not trying to be Kale or live up to some impossible standard. I'm just, me. Broken, desperate, second best me. And for some insane reason, that seemed to be enough for you. His voice cracked. Until you found out the truth. Through the window, she could see the pack below growing restless. Some had begun to pace, others were snapping at the air, and all of them were looking up at her building with eyes that burned like golden fire. They wanted answers. They wanted justice. And they wanted it now. The right of sanctuary, she said slowly. If I invoke it, if I claim you as my mate, what exactly does that mean? What am I agreeing to? Kieran's expression was tortured. It means binding your life to mine forever. It means accepting me as your other half, your partner in everything. It means trusting me with your heart, your soul, your very existence. He took a shuddering breath. And it means that if the magic rejects our bond, if the pack decides we're not true mates, we both die together. The stakes couldn't be higher. Her life, his life, and the future of an entire pack balanced on a decision she had to make in the next 3 minutes. Seraphina closed her eyes and tried to think past the betrayal, past the hurt, past the anger that burned in her chest like acid. What did she know about Kieran that was real? What had been truth and what had been lies? He'd protected her from Matthias, no, from the man she'd thought was Matthias but who turned out to be her brother. He'd made her feel valued and beautiful and strong. He'd risked his life to keep her safe, even knowing it might expose his deception. And when she discovered the truth about her heritage, he'd stood by her side instead of running from the danger she represented. But he'd also manipulated her, used her, built their entire relationship on a foundation of deception. He'd let her believe he was someone he wasn't, had power he didn't possess, could offer protection he might not be able to provide. How could she trust someone who'd lied about everything that mattered? A sharp knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Time's up," Marcus called. "The pack is getting restless. We need to go downstairs now." Seraphina opened her eyes and found Kieran watching her with the expression of a man facing his own execution. "Whatever you decide," he said quietly, "I want you to know that every moment with you has been worth whatever comes next." She looked at him, this broken, desperate, beautiful liar who'd somehow become the most important person in her world, and realized that the choice had already been made. Not by logic or wisdom or careful consideration, but by something deeper and more primitive. Something that recognized him as hers, despite everything. "If we do this," she said, and saw hope flicker in his golden eyes. "If I invoke the right of sanctuary and claim you as my mate, no more lies. Ever. About anything." He nodded frantically. "No more lies. I swear it on my brother's grave." Another knock, more insistent this time. "Now, Ashwood. Bring her down now or we come up and drag you both." Seraphina took a deep breath and made a choice that would either save them both or doom them together. "Then let's go face your pack," she said, taking his hand in hers. "Let's go find out if what we have is real enough to survive the truth." As they walked toward the door, toward the 100 wolves waiting below, toward a future that hung in the balance between love and deception, Seraphina felt the awakening power in her blood respond to her decision. The Nightwalker abilities her mother had bound were stirring, called forth by the magnitude of what she was about to attempt. And for the first time since learning the truth about Kieran's identity, she felt something other than betrayal and anger. She felt hope. Chapter 5, The Challenge. The wolves parted like water as Kieran led Seraphina down the front steps of her building. Up close, they were even more magnificent and terrifying, creatures the size of small horses with muscles that rippled beneath thick fur and eyes that held centuries of wild wisdom. None of them made a sound, but she could feel their attention like a physical weight, analyzing her every movement, every breath. Marcus stepped forward from the pack, a massive black wolf with silver markings around his muzzle. When he shifted, the transformation was fluid, bones reshaping and fur melting away until a tall man with dark hair and cold gray eyes stood before them naked and unashamed. "You've brought a human into pack business, Kieran," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "That's a violation of the oldest laws." "She's under my protection," Kieran replied, moving slightly in front of Seraphina. "The laws also state that an alpha's chosen mate is pack, regardless of species." Marcus's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. "Chosen mate? You've known her for less than a week. This isn't about protection, brother, this is about your human fixation clouding your judgment again." The other wolves shifted restlessly, some growling low agreement with Marcus's words. Seraphina could feel the tension building like electricity before a storm. "What happened last time?" she whispered to Kieran, and his jaw tightened. "There was another human," he said quietly. Sarah. I thought I loved her, thought she could handle our world. She couldn't. She ran to the hunters, told them everything. 43 of my pack died in the slaughter that followed. And now you want us to trust another human? Marcus snarled, his form rippling as his wolf pressed closer to the surface. How many more of our family will die for your weakness? The accusation hit Kieran like a physical blow, and Seraphina saw centuries of guilt and pain flash across his features. But before he could respond, she stepped forward, placing herself between the two alphas. I'm not Sarah, she said clearly, her voice carrying across the assembled pack. I don't know what she did, but I know what I won't do. I won't run. I won't betray you. And I won't let anyone hurt what's mine. Her eyes found Kieran's, and she saw wonder bloom in those golden depths. If you want to challenge his judgment, then challenge me too. Marcus's eyes flashed with dangerous amusement. A human challenging werewolf law? How refreshing. He began to circle Seraphina like a predator sizing up prey, and the pack pressed closer, sensing blood in the water. Very well. Trial by combat. If you survive 1 hour against 3 of my choosing, we'll consider accepting you. If you don't. He smiled, showing teeth that were still too sharp in his human form. No, Kieran snarled, power rolling off him in waves that made the other wolves whimper and submit. She's not a warrior. This is murder, not justice. But Seraphina placed a hand on his arm, feeling the coiled tension in his muscles. I accept, she said quietly, and the words carried across the street like a death sentence. But I have one condition. If I survive, Marcus steps down as beta. If I don't, you leave Kieran alone. His choices are his own. The 3 wolves Marcus chose were massive, scarred veterans with eyes like winter ice. They shifted simultaneously, and Seraphina found herself facing down creatures that could have torn her apart in seconds. But as the first one lunged, something strange happened. Time seemed to slow, and she could see the attack coming as clearly as if she were watching a movie. She ducked, rolled, came up with a broken piece of concrete from the street. Pain exploded across her ribs as claws raked her side, but instead of falling, she spun and brought the concrete down on the wolf's skull with a crack that echoed off the buildings. The creature yelped and staggered back, blood streaming from its head. The pack was silent now, watching in stunned disbelief as this small human woman held her own against 3 of their strongest warriors. But as Seraphina moved through the combat, something fundamental was changing inside her. Each dodge, each strike, each moment of contact with the wolves seemed to unlock memories that weren't her own. Flashes of knowledge flooded her mind, pressure points that would drop a werewolf instantly, angles of attack that could shatter supernatural bone, ways to read the micro-expressions that preceded a shapeshifter's transformation. This wasn't learning. This was remembering. The second wolf circled behind her, trying to flank while she was distracted with the first. But somehow, impossibly, she knew it was there before she could see or hear it. Every nerve in her body screamed danger, and she spun just as massive jaws snapped closed where her neck had been. Her hands shot out instinctively, fingers finding the exact spot beneath the wolf's jaw that would temporarily paralyze its vocal cords. The beast made a choked, gasping sound and stumbled backward. How? Marcus breathed, his confident expression faltering for the first time. How does she know our weaknesses? But Seraphina was beyond hearing him. The world had narrowed to a tunnel of preternatural focus, every sense heightened beyond human capability. She could smell the individual sense of each pack member, hear heartbeats from blocks away, see the minute tensing of muscles that preceded every attack. This wasn't possible. Humans didn't have these abilities. The third wolf, larger than the other 2 combined, approached more cautiously. Its pale eyes held intelligence and cunning that spoke of decades of experience in pack warfare. This one wouldn't underestimate her, wouldn't rush in blind. It would test her, probe for weaknesses, wait for her energy to fade. But as their eyes met across the circle of watching wolves, Seraphina felt something cold and predatory unfurl in her chest. Something that recognized this creature not as a worthy opponent, but as prey. The thought should have horrified her. These were Kieran's people, his family, his pack. She was supposed to be fighting for acceptance, for the right to stand among them as an equal. But the awakening power in her blood whispered different truths. These weren't her people. They were her natural enemies, creatures her bloodline had been specifically designed to hunt and destroy. And with that realization came a flood of inherited knowledge that made her stagger. Nightbane. The name echoed through her consciousness like a death knell. Not Nightwalker, that had been the sanitized version, the name her mother had given her to hide the truth. Nightbane was what the supernatural world called her family line. Wolf killers. The boogeyman that werewolf mothers used to frighten their cubs into obedience. The human dynasty that had perfected the art of supernatural extermination over 13 generations. The third wolf attacked while she was reeling from the revelation, massive jaws aimed at her throat. But even distracted, even horrified by what she was learning about herself, her body moved with lethal precision. She sidestepped the lunge, caught the wolf's front leg as it passed, and twisted with a motion that sent the creature crashing into the pavement with a bone-jarring impact. The watching pack flinched as one, recognizing the move from their oldest nightmares. Impossible, one of the younger wolves whispered. The Nightbane line was wiped out 50 years ago. The last of them died in the Prague massacre. But Marcus was backing away now, his face white with terror that had nothing to do with respect and everything to do with genetic memory. No, he breathed. Not dead. Hidden. Sleeping. Waiting. His eyes found Kieran's across the circle. Do you have any idea what you've brought into our midst? Kieran looked confused, torn between pride in Seraphina's fighting ability and growing alarm at the pack's reaction. She's awakening her dormant wolf heritage, he said desperately. This proves she belongs with us. But Marcus's harsh laugh cut through his words like a blade. Wolf heritage? You fool. She doesn't have a drop of wolf blood in her veins. What's awakening is something far worse. The first wolf had recovered enough to rejoin the fight, blood still streaming from its head wound. But as it moved to attack, something in its approach triggered another flood of inherited memory. Seraphina saw the attack pattern, recognized the telltale signs of a werewolf preparing to shift mid-lunge, and moved to counter with a technique that had been perfected 3 centuries before she was born. Her hand shot out, fingers extended in a precise strike that found the cluster of nerve endings at the base of the wolf's spine. The creature dropped like a stone, paralyzed but conscious, its eyes wide with terror as it stared up at her. Around the circle, the pack began to back away en masse, some whimpering low in their throats, others baring their necks in instinctive submission to a predator they recognized on a cellular level. This wasn't respect. This was fear. Pure, primal, evolutionary fear. Nightbane techniques, Marcus said, his voice hollow with shock. Pressure point strikes designed specifically to disable werewolf anatomy. Combat patterns that have been refined over centuries to exploit our natural weaknesses. He turned to the pack, his expression grim. She's not one of us. She's the thing we were bred to fear. Seraphina stared down at her hands, watching the cuts from the wolf's claws seal themselves with supernatural speed. Her healing wasn't wolf fast, it was something else entirely, something that worked by different rules. The blood on her fingers seemed to glow in the morning light, and she could smell her own scent changing, becoming sharper, more predatory, tinged with something that made every wolf in sight nervous. What's happening to me, she whispered, but she already knew. The genetic locks her mother had placed on her abilities were breaking down, triggered by the life-or-death combat situation. Generations of carefully bred enhancements were coming online, enhanced reflexes, supernatural strength, the ability to read and counter supernatural opponents with deadly precision. She was becoming what her bloodline had always been intended to be, the perfect werewolf killer. The second wolf, the one she'd struck in the throat, was backing away on trembling legs. Its vocal cords had healed enough for it to speak, and the words that came out were barely above a terrified whisper. The scent. Dear gods, the scent. It's exactly like the stories described. It turned to Marcus with desperate eyes. She smells like death. Like Silver and Moon's bane and the ending of all things. Because that's what she is, Marcus said grimly. The Night Bane weren't just hunters. They were weapons. Human beings genetically modified over centuries to be the ultimate supernatural predators. Enhanced strength, supernatural reflexes, the ability to predict and counter our attacks before we make them. His eyes found Seraphina's, and she saw something in them that chilled her to the bone. They don't just kill werewolves. They're designed to enjoy it. The words hit her like a physical blow. Even now, standing in this circle of terrified wolves, she could feel a dark satisfaction curling in her chest. Part of her, a part that was growing stronger by the moment, was pleased by their fear. Excited by the prospect of violence. Eager to test her newly awakened abilities against worthy prey. The thought horrified her, but she couldn't deny its presence. No, Kieran said, moving to stand between Seraphina and the pack. I don't care what bloodline she comes from. She's not a killer. She's gentle, kind, protective, but his words were cut off as one of the watching wolves suddenly lunged at Seraphina's back, either testing her defenses or genuinely trying to end the threat she represented. Seraphina moved without thinking, her body acting on instincts that predated her birth by centuries. She spun, caught the wolf's head between her hands, and twisted with surgical precision. The snap of breaking vertebrae echoed across the street like a gunshot. The wolf dropped lifeless at her feet, and the silence that followed was deafening. The pack stared at the corpse in stunned horror. This hadn't been a combat move, a defensive technique, or an accident. This had been an execution, carried out with the cold efficiency of a born predator. And the expression on Seraphina's face as she stared down at her victim wasn't shock or remorse. It was satisfaction. There, Marcus said quietly. Do you see it now? The way she looks at his body? That's not grief or horror, Kieran. That's pride. That's a Nightbane admiring her work. He took a careful step backward. She just killed one of our pack members without hesitation, without remorse, without even blinking. How long before she decides the rest of us need to die too? Seraphina stared down at her hands, watching the dead wolf's blood drip from her fingers. She should have been horrified, sickened, traumatized by what she'd done. Instead, she felt accomplished. Like she'd completed a task she'd been born to perform. The realization made her stomach turn, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this was right, natural, inevitable. I didn't mean to, she whispered, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. Because part of her, a growing, strengthening part, had meant to. Had wanted to. Had been eager to demonstrate her superiority over these creatures who dared to threaten what was hers. I was defending myself. He attacked first. You broke his neck with your bare hands, one of the younger wolves said, his voice shaking. Do you have any idea how much strength that takes? How much precision? You moved like you'd done it 1,000 times before. His eyes were wide with terror. How many of our kind have you killed? None, Seraphina said desperately. This is the first time I've ever, but then another memory surfaced, older and hazier than the others. A camping trip when she was 12, getting separated from her mother in the woods. Something large and predatory stalking her through the trees. The scent of wet fur and wild danger. And then, nothing. A blank space in her memory where something important should have been. The amnesia blocks, Marcus said, watching her face carefully. Your mother didn't just bind your abilities. She suppressed your memories too. How many kills do you think she helped you forget? How many times did you accidentally reveal your true nature as a child? His smile was sharp and knowing. The Nightbane always manifested early. Usually around puberty, when the first supernatural encounter triggered their awakening. More memories were trying to surface now, clawing their way up from whatever mental barriers her mother had constructed. Flashes of violence, of satisfaction, of standing over fallen shapes that might have been human or might have been something else entirely. How much of her life had been edited, sanitized, hidden from her own consciousness? Stop, Kieran said desperately. You're traumatizing her. Can't you see she's fighting this? But Marcus shook his head grimly. She's not fighting it. She's embracing it. Look at her stance, her breathing, the way she's positioned herself between the body and potential threats. Every instinct she has is telling her to hunt, to kill, to eliminate anything that might pose a danger to her territory. And he was right. Seraphina could feel it happening, feel the careful walls her mother had built around her true nature crumbling piece by piece. The gentle, frightened waitress was being subsumed by something far older and more dangerous. Something that looked at the assembled pack and saw not Kieran's family, but targets. Threats to be neutralized. Prey to be hunted. The trial is over, she said, and her voice had changed. Gone was the uncertainty, the fear, the desperate need for acceptance. What remained was cold authority, the voice of someone who had never doubted her right to command. I survived your test. Now honor the terms of our agreement. Marcus laughed, the sound bitter and frightened. Honor our agreement? With a Nightbane? You might as well ask us to honor an agreement with a forest fire or a plague. He turned to address the pack, his voice carrying clearly across the street. This creature is not one of us. She never was and never could be. Her very existence is an affront to everything we are. Then challenge me, Seraphina said quietly, and the words sent a ripple of shock through the assembled wolves. Invoke the ancient laws. Alpha to alpha, strength against strength. Winner takes everything. She smiled, and in the morning light, her teeth looked as sharp as any werewolf's. Unless you're afraid. The taunt hit its mark. Marcus's eyes blazed with fury, his human form rippling as his wolf pressed against the surface. Around them, the pack began to back away, giving them room for what everyone knew was coming. This wasn't going to be a civilized duel or a ritualized combat. This was going to be a war between natural enemies, fought with all the savagery that centuries of genetic hatred could inspire. Seraphina, no, Kieran pleaded, but she barely heard him. The awakening power in her blood was singing now, calling for violence, for the chance to prove her superiority over these lesser predators. You don't understand what you're asking for. Marcus is one of the strongest wolves in the pack. He's killed dozens of supernatural threats. Good, she said, and meant it. I was hoping for a challenge. She looked at Marcus with predatory anticipation. Well? Are you going to shift, or do you prefer to die in human form? The casual way she spoke of his death, the certainty in her voice that she would be the victor, it sent cold fear racing through every wolf present. Because they all recognized what she'd become. Not a potential pack member, not a supernatural ally, not even an enemy they could reason with or negotiate against. She was Nightbane, the thing their ancestors had fled across oceans to escape, the monster that had haunted werewolf nightmares for 13 generations. And she was standing in their midst, awakened and hungry for blood. By the time the hour was up, Seraphina was bleeding from a dozen wounds, her clothes were in tatters, and one of the wolves was dead at her feet. But she was still standing, still breathing, still defiant. Marcus stared at her with something that might have been respect, if respect could coexist with absolute terror. Impossible, he whispered. No human could. He stopped abruptly, his nostrils flaring as he caught a scent that made his eyes go wide. You're not entirely human, are you? And as the morning sun climbed higher, Seraphina felt something wild and powerful stirring in her blood, something that had been sleeping her whole life until this moment when she needed it most. Something that whispered of silver blades and moonless nights, of the hunt eternal and the satisfaction of prey brought low. She was awakening to her true heritage at last, and every wolf within a mile could smell their own extinction on the wind. The pack fell to their knees as one, heads bowed in submission that had nothing to do with defeat and everything to do with recognition. Impossible, Marcus breathed again, but his voice held on now instead of disbelief. A dormant bloodline. We thought they were all extinct. Seraphina swayed on her feet, the adrenaline finally fading to leave behind a bone-deep exhaustion and the strangest sense of coming home. Kieran caught her before she could fall, his arms wrapping around her like they were meant to be there. "What's happening to me?" she whispered against his chest, feeling something fundamental shifting in her very bones. "You're awakening," he said softly, wonder threading through his voice. "Your bloodline goes back to the first pack, the original wolves who could shift between forms at will. That's why you could fight them. That's why you've always felt different." The wounds on her body were already beginning to heal, skin knitting itself back together with supernatural speed. Marcus approached slowly, his gray eyes holding none of their earlier hostility. "Alpha Queen," he said formally, offering his throat in the ultimate gesture of submission. "Forgive my blindness. I should have recognized your scent from the beginning." Around them, the pack began to shift back to human form, and every face held the same expression of reverent amazement. Kieran's hands framed her face gently, golden eyes searching hers. "The choice is yours, Seraphina. You could walk away right now, go back to your human life, pretend none of this ever happened. Or..." He took a breath that seemed to come from his very soul. "You could stay. Be my mate, my equal, my queen. Help me lead our people into whatever comes next." She thought of her empty apartment, her lonely existence, the years of hiding and fear. Then she looked at the 100 wolves who had come to judge her and stayed to kneel at her feet. "I choose you," she whispered, and the words tasted like destiny on her tongue. "I choose all of this." Kieran's kiss was soft and fierce and full of promises she was finally brave enough to believe. But as their lips met, a new scent carried on the morning wind, smoke and silver and something ancient and angry. In the shadows between buildings, other eyes watched them with predatory patience. The hunters had found them at last, and the real war was just beginning. For the first time, Seraphina felt safe in Kieran's arms, but in the shadows of the city, another pair of golden eyes had already chosen her fate.